The grand choice. The Pierce estate wore winter like a crown, every eve trimmed with crystal frost, and the long drive lined by lanterns whose warm circles of light puddled on the snow. And inside the grand hall, 100 conversations sparkled at once, a soft rush of string music folding over the clink of glass, and at the center of it all stood Alexander Pierce, a man whose name opened doors and moved markets, whose tuxedo fit like a decision, who had taught himself to hold grief the way he held a pen, firm and without tremor, even when it was heavy, even when it cut into the skin, because tonight was about image and order, the public return of a father who had been a shadow since his wife's passing, and he had promised his board, his investors, and the magazines that he was ready to lead at home as well as at work, ready to put the word family beside his last name again. On the landing above the hall, Ethan Pierce hovered at the balustrade, small hands wrapped around the rail, the tuxedo jacket that had felt like armor 2 hours ago now too stiff and too loud, his hair combed to precise angles and his shoes shiny enough to show the winter lights, but his chest felt empty the way it did when the house got too quiet, when footsteps faded and his father's voice came only through doors, and he wished he could be in the kitchen where it was bright with warmth and cinnamon, where a steady voice told him stories that knew how to end, where the kettle sang like a friend, because in that place his mother's absence hurt less, and nothing in the hall below, not the music or the glimmer or the smiles, could give him what the kitchen could. The feeling that someone saw him first and saw the party second. Maya Johnson had arrived 2 hours before the guests, slipping through staff entrances with the practiced rhythm of a person who respected other people's spaces, her navy uniforms, arm pressed, her hair tied into a neat bun that kept the world out of her eyes, her hands clean and careful around crystal and silver, and she moved through the mansion with a quiet map in her head, where each drawer could be found in the dark, and each squeaky floorboard demanded a gentler step. Because this was work, and work had rules, and the rule she always kept closest was dignity, hers and everyone else's. And though some guests did not see her, the staff did, and though some people only knew her as the woman who made things spotless, the house knew more because when Ethan fell sick last autumn and the night stretched thin, it was Maya who kept watch at the bedtime chair, her voice lifting the edges of the dark with stories about bridges and bright mornings and a train that never stopped until it brought you home. The party had a script, crafted by Harper Lynn, Alexander's head of communications, who could fold a problem into a headline and make it look like a win, and her plan was elegant: to host a winter charity gala for literacy programs, to surround Alexander with purpose and light, and then, near the end, to introduce 3 women, accomplished, admired, kind, who were interested in Alexander and respected Ethan's privacy, women who had their own charities and careers, who knew cameras but also quiet. And if a new chapter would one day begin, perhaps it might begin in a room like this, under chandeliers that pretended stars could be brought indoors, and the evening would end with a photo that looked like a beginning. Alexander told himself this was rational, not a performance, that a child needed stability, and that adults needed courage to take steps that felt staged. And when Harper nodded from the far side of the room, he lifted his glass and spoke with the confident warmth he could turn on like a porch light, thanking everyone for their generosity and for believing in the mission of books and opportunity. And then he said what he had rehearsed, that he wished to show Ethan that love could be chosen again, that love could be safe, and he gestured toward the 3 women who stood near the string quartet, not as ornaments but as people. A pediatrician who ran a free clinic on Saturdays, a STEM advocate who built after-school programs, and a museum curator who turned dusty corners into wonder. And he invited Ethan down to meet them, to say hello, to see that the world was not only a place where things were lost, but also a place where new things could be found. Ethan's throat tightened as he descended, and each step felt like walking into a story he had not agreed to, the faces blurring in soft gold, the smile his father wore sitting wrong on his face like a collar that scratched, and the women looked kind, or at least practiced at kindness in rooms that watched them, and he did not think they were bad. He did not think they were cruel. He only thought that they were strangers, and that the person who made this house feel like a lighthouse in fog did not stand near the quartet or the cameras. And he looked up at his father once, and Alexander nodded in what he believed was reassurance, and in that moment Ethan understood something simple and unshareable in adult language, that love was not a choice made on a stage. It was a door that had been open all along. Maya was in the corridor that cut behind the hall, balancing a tray of tea and honey for the staff on their break, listening listening to the speech as it flowed through the air vents, the words about community and hope. And when the music paused, she naturally paused too, because sound is a tide that moves all boats, and she turned a corner and saw Ethan at the bottom of the stairs, small and brave and alone, and something in her wanted to go to him, to bend and straighten his lapel and remind him of the trick for not fidgeting, count the breaths between the violin notes. But she reminded herself that tonight she belonged to the quiet spaces, not the bright ones, and she stood still, unseen, ready to move if a glass shattered or a spill needed catching. Harper, watching the room the way a conductor watches a symphony, expected applause at a certain beat, and when it did not come, when the air hung in that beat of silence that forms before a choice, she felt the delicate machine of the evening slip a gear. Because Ethan had not stepped toward the three women, he had turned, slow as a tide turning, and his small finger pointed not toward sequins or cameras, but toward the corridor where a navy uniform had paused at the very edge of the light, and in that moment, the hall learned something truer than any script, that a child's clarity is the cleanest mirror in any house. "I choose Maya," Ethan said, his voice shaking but not breaking, and the words did not boom or ring. They simply moved through the room like a warm wind under a door, and some guests heard only the surprise of it, and some heard the tenderness, and a few heard a bell that had not sounded here in years, the sound of the house discovering its own heart, and for a breath the string players did not lift their bows, because it felt wrong to fill that pause with ornament, and for a breath Maya did not move because moving felt like breaking a spell, and for a breath Alexander Pierce stood between two futures and decided without decidin', which way he would lean. Alexander loved his son, and anyone who knew him well knew that it was not a brittle love or a distant one, but a love that had been built awkwardly under the weight of loss, and he had made plans as a way to protect Ethan from chaos, plans that involved schedules and tutors and interviews with child therapists who spoke of transitions and attachment, and in those plans, there had never been room for the unplanned truth of a child pointing at a person who had never asked to be pointed at, and in that sudden light he felt the cold hand of embarrassment wrap around the back of his neck, because he understood how the room would read it, how headlines might turn it, and he felt the scrape of pride where humility should have been, and in that scrape his voice lost its gentleness. "Ethan," he said, and the syllables clicked on his teeth. "This is not a game." And he meant to say more, to guide, to soften, to shape the moment into something palatable. But he saw how Ethan's shoulders tightened, how the boy drew himself a fraction backward, and he saw, too, the way Maya took one small step forward, as if to catch a falling thing, tray still balanced, eyes steady, not pleading, not performing, simply present the way a lighthouse is present when a boat needs a direction that is not a command but a fact. Maya had been a child who learned early that rooms could turn on you, classrooms where laughter could fold out of nowhere and follow you home, waiting rooms where your name took longer to be called, offices where you were thanked with a tone that meant something else, and she had come to understand that dignity is not a shield you carry, it is a language you speak to yourself, and so when Ethan spoke her name into that bright room, she did not smile or wave. She did not shrink either. She only breathed and set down the tray on a sideboard and wiped her hands as she always did after. Carrying china, and she waited for what would come next. Because you cannot stop a tide by raising your hand. You can only place your feet carefully and face it. The three women closest to Alexander traded small looks, not cruel, not amused, simply surprised, because they had not expected to be part of a story about a boy's longing. They had expected to be part of a calendar and a headline and a photograph that did not ask too much. And to their credit, each one softened. The pediatrician's mouth making a tender line, the advocate tilting her head with real curiosity, the curator nodding at Maya with a respect that said she saw what everyone else was suddenly seeing, and for a moment there was a path available in that room where kindness could have made a bridge. But pride is a quick architect, and it can build walls fast. "Ethan," Alexander tried again, and he lowered his voice now because he felt the room's attention collect like dew. "You can greet Ms. Patel, Dr. Nguyen, Ms. Reyes first, and then you may speak to Ms. Johnson." And he thought, in the split second between the words leaving his mouth and the reaction he hoped for, that he had compromised, that he had balanced love with optics, that he had found a polite stairway down from a precipice. But politeness is not the same as respect, and children know the difference without needing it explained. Ethan took one step, and instead of toward the women or toward his father, he stepped toward Maya, and his hands were shaking now because he was still 7 years old in a room that had never been built for 7-year-old feelings. And his voice lifted again, and this time it did ring, not like thunder, but like a bell used to call people to dinner, ordinary and sacred. "I want her to be my mom," he said, and the word mom landed in the hall with the weight of need and memory and possibility, and the room shifted, and the lights felt warmer, and under all the glimmer a simple truth stood up and faced the adults. Harper felt the script dissolve in her hands like sugar in hot water, and she knew the cameras would find their angles no matter what she did. And she also knew, from a decade of smoothing the rough edges of rich people's lives, that sometimes the truest move was to put down the smoothing iron and let the wrinkle be visible, because real can save you when perfect cannot. And she caught Alexander's eye and gave him a look that said, "Choose your son before you choose the photo." And for a heartbeat he almost did. He almost laughed and lifted Ethan and said, of course we can talk to everyone in our own time, but habit can be louder than love when love is afraid." "Ms. Johnson," Alexander said, and he did not mean for his voice to be formal. "Perhaps you could take Ethan to the study for a moment." And the way he said it made the request sound like dismissal, and the line between a request and a dismissal is thin, but visible to a child who has learned to read weather. And Ethan flinched, and Maya felt it like a small wind against her cheek, and she nodded once because she understood the job, and because right now, above her feelings, there was a boy in front of her who needed a smaller room, and she extended her hand and not her arms, because children sometimes need the bridge and not the ferry. In the study, the world shrank to books and a fireplace tick that sounded like a clock learning to breathe. And Maya guided Ethan to the sofa and sat near, not close enough to crowd, and she said what she always said when he was shaking. "Count the warm things." And he frowned and tried, the way he always did. "The fire, your voice, the blanket, the cocoa last week that made my tongue hurt in a good way." And the corners of his mouth softened, and Maya breathed with him, long, even, like her grandmother had taught her when the world's noise tried to get inside, and she fed him water and a napkin, because sometimes dignity begins with small kindness. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan asked into the back of his hand, and Maya shook her head, gentle and sure. "You told the truth of your heart, and that is not wrong, even when it arrives at an inconvenient time." And he exhaled, and something fragile inside him did not break, and she reminded him that many adults do not know how to carry a child's truth without spilling it, and that did not make those adults bad. It only made them in need of practice. And he nodded because children understand practice, and then, because he was 7 and bravery is heavy, he let his shoulder lean into her arm, and Maya allowed it, because boundaries and comfort can live in the same room when they are handled with care. Alexander did not come to the study right away, because 100 people waited, and hundreds more were looking through lenses, and he had to steady a night that had slipped to the edges, to thank the women with grace, to release the quartet into a waltz that refilled the air, to reassure donors that generosity had not been wasted, to nod and nod and nod until the hallway cleared enough for him to hear his own feet. And he did all of this with the face he wore when an earnings call went sideways, composed, articulate, persuasive, and as he moved through the tasks like a man crossing stepping stones, the small voice at the center of him kept asking the question he had avoided for 2 years. "What do you want your son to remember about you when he is grown?" When he finally lifted the latch and entered the study, the quiet reached for him, and he saw Ethan with a pillow hugged to his middle and Maya beside him like a harbor next to a small boat, and something in his chest loosened because the scene was gentle, not dramatic, because love so often looked like this, ordinary and calm, and it hurt, the way relief can hurt when it rubs against pride, and he cleared his throat and thanked Maya, and he asked if he could have a moment alone with his son, and he remembered to make it a request and not a command, and she nodded and rose, and in passing she placed a glass of water at the corner of his desk, a gesture without theater, and he sat down as the door closed, suddenly a father in a room with his child, not a CEO in a room with a problem. They spoke without cameras, and Ethan asked why the world had to watch them choose things that should be quiet. And Alexander said because sometimes he forgot the difference between life and the story told about life, and the boy, who understood more than adults believed and less than they feared, asked if it was okay that he had chosen, and Alexander wanted to say yes and mean it without qualification. But the words stuck on his teeth again and came out softened but not pure. He said that it was okay to say what you want, even when it surprises people. And Ethan frowned because he heard the hedge, and hedges are useful for gardens and less useful for hearts, and the conversation folded into a careful end, and Alexander promised an answer tomorrow, and he meant it as a promise to think, rather than to delay. But to a child tomorrow is a cliff you cannot see beyond. The hall resumed its glitter. The guests drifted into goodbyes packaged in compliments. Harper assembled the press summary that would not lie and would not reveal. The three women left with quiet grace that did them credit, and thus staff reset the house to its normal posture, the way a stage sighs after the curtain falls, and when the last car turned the last curve of the drive, the estate exhaled, and the new snow that had begun during dessert now lay across the lawn like a soft thought that had not yet found words. Maya returned to the kitchen to help close, her movements the same as always, because steadiness is a gift you can give yourself, and her mind replayed the moment again and again, not to savor it, but to fold it into a place where it could be carried without spilling into everything, because tomorrow she would wake and put on the uniform and be the same person she had been today, a person who brought order to rooms and warmth to a child, and respect to herself even when respect was not handed to her, and she told herself the rule again, the one that kept her whole: do the next kind task and the next right thing. Upstairs, Ethan lay awake longer than he wanted, listening to the small clicks a house makes when it changes from party to sleep, the vents humming low, the old wood talking in little sighs, and the snow called to him the way winter can call to a child who wants to see proof that the world can be new in the morning. And he thought about choices, and about pictures, and about the way his father had looked when he spoke like a man who was trying to hold a cup without spilling. And he did not want to be in a room with words anymore. He wanted the soft sound the garden made in winter, where trees wear quiet like a coat. He slipped from bed and into the warmest coat he could find at the foot of the closet, the one Maya had fixed a button on, the thread still neat and strong, and he pushed his feet into boots and did what children always do when their hearts are loud. He believed the night would be gentle because it had always been gentle when Maya was near, and he opened his door and the hallway was a pale river of light, and he padded down it, quick and quiet, past the landing where the party had happened, past the study where the air kept the shape of the conversation, past the sideboard where a single teacup waited to be washed, and he pressed his small hand to the back door and let the cold reach up and touch his face like a question. Maya was wiping the last counter when something in the noise of the house changed, not a sound exactly but the absence of one, a silence shaped like Ethan's careful steps, and some people call it intuition, but she thought of it as attention practiced over years, the way a mother hears a sigh upstairs or a teacher feels a room lean toward mischief before it tips. And she set the cloth down and listened, really listened, and the refrigerator hum and the sink drip and the clock tick stayed steady, and beneath them, faint as a thread in the snow, she felt the back door's breath, that thin strip of cold that sneaks in when a seal breaks, and she moved toward it, slow but sure, the way you move toward a sleeping animal so as not to startle it into running. Outside, the lanterns were dimmed to pearls, the path ruffled with a new dusting, the kind that erases old footprints and makes everything look like a beginning. And in the middle distance the garden stretched toward the small man-made lake that had worn a skin of ice since last week, a skin that looked solid from the window and complicated from the shore, and a small figure in a too large coat was all red. Halfway down the steps, careful, brave, not yet aware of how quickly beauty can become thin underfoot, and Maya's mouth formed his name before her voice found it, and the night held the sound the way a theater holds a line before applause, and in the big quiet between the name and the reply, the winter wind lifted like a curtain. And that was how part one ended in the Pierce house, with a father at the top of the stairs holding a decision that felt heavier than a share price, with a child at the edge of a brightness he could not measure, with a woman who had learned to move toward trouble, not because she loved danger, but because she loved people. And the snow kept falling in tiny, steady pieces that made the whole world look softened, even as something sharp waited beneath it. And when Maya stepped out into the cold, every instinct she had ever trusted woke at once, because sometimes the next kind task is also the most urgent one, and sometimes the next right thing is the thing you do before your mind has time to argue. And she drew in breath that burned her lungs and called Ethan's name again as the garden opened its white door, and the night, polite and unreadable, listened. The wound and the rescue. The garden stretched like a silver canvas under the night sky, every branch coated in frost that glimmered in the moonlight, every pathway softened by snow that muffled footsteps into whispers, and Ethan's small boots left a trail that curved toward the lake, a frozen mirror that looked beautiful from a distance and harmless to a child's hopeful eyes, though in truth it was thin and treacherous. His breath puffed into little clouds, quick and uneven as he trudged further, his mind still carrying the weight of what had happened in the grand hall. He had not meant to embarrass his father or confuse the guests. He had only spoken the truth of his heart, and when his father had not embraced that truth, something inside him ached. Out here in the cold, away from chandeliers and music, the ache felt smaller, as though the snow itself could hush it. The boy wanted to be where the world was quiet, where no one corrected his choices or asked him to smile for pictures he did not understand. Maya hurried through the back door the moment she realized the child was outside, the winter air biting against her face like needles, but she did not flinch. Her eyes scanned the garden with the sharpness of someone who had long ago trained herself to notice what others overlooked. The tilt of a shadow, the pause in a sound, the faintest signs of danger. And there, near the curve of the stone steps, she spotted him. A small figure walking toward the frozen lake, coat oversized, boots sinking lightly into snow. Her heart seized. She called his name once, firm but gentle, the way she always spoke to him when he was frightened. Ethan glanced back, the moonlight catching the wetness on his lashes, but he did not stop. Children do not always understand that worry is love wearing its sharpest coat. Sometimes they only feel the pull of their own loneliness. Inside the house, Alexander had just dismissed the last guest when Harper leaned close and murmured that Ethan had slipped away, that Maya had followed him, that the back door was open to the snow. For a man who measured risks in billions and watched numbers shift like tides, the words landed heavier than any market crash. He sprinted across the marble floor, his shoes loud in the silence of a house no longer filled with applause. The cold slapped him as he burst outside, his breath already ragged, his eyes scanning until they locked on the two figures near the lake. He shouted his son's name, but the night was wide, and Ethan, stubborn and hurt, kept walking toward the glittering surface that beckoned with deceptive beauty. The ice cracked with a sound that split the garden open, sharp and brutal, louder than any music that had filled the hall earlier. Ethan gasped, the ground beneath him fracturing like glass beneath a hammer, and suddenly the snow that had seemed solid gave way to black water that lunged upward to swallow him whole. His cry was short, choked by the shock of icy water, his small hands thrashing desperately at the jagged edges of broken ice. Panic flared in his chest. The cold stabbed him with 100 knives, stealing breath faster than he could fight for it. Maya did not think. She moved. Her boots tore across the snow as though pulled by something greater than instinct, her breath burning, her arms pumping, the world narrowing to a single point, the child sinking into the darkness. She hit the shore and threw herself onto the ice, feeling it protest beneath her weight, but she crawled forward on her belly, spreading herself wide, each movement deliberate and desperate. The lake groaned, threatening to betray her, but she did not stop. She stretched her arm out toward Ethan's flailing hand, her voice low and steady, even as her lungs screamed against the cold. "Hold on, Ethan. Hold my hand and don't let go." Ethan's frozen fingers brushed against hers once, slipped, then caught again. She gripped hard, pulling with every muscle, her body straining, her arms shaking as she anchored herself against the unbroken edge of the ice. Inch by inch, she dragged him toward safety, the water clawing at them both, the ice cracking wider beneath the pressure. Alexander reached the bank just as Maya hauled Ethan out, his small body dripping, trembling, lips pale. She collapsed backward into the snow with him against her chest, wrapping her coat around him without hesitation, holding him so close that her own body heat became his only shield against the merciless cold. Alexander dropped to his knees beside them, his breath tearing from his chest, his face pale as the moon. He reached for his son, but Ethan buried his face against Maya's shoulder, sobbing, clinging to her as if the world itself might vanish if he let go. Alexander froze, a strange hollow opening in his chest as he realized the truth laid bare before him. His son's first instinct had not been to reach for his father's arms, but for Maya's. Pride, reputation, wealth, none of it mattered in this moment. What mattered was whose arms had been there when he was falling. Maya pressed her cheek to Ethan's wet hair, whispering steady words that cut through the storm of his sobs. "You're safe now. I've got you. I won't let go." The firmness of her voice was a vow, one she had no intention of breaking, even if it cost her everything. Alexander looked at her then, not as the maid in a uniform, not as the staff member hidden at the edges of photographs, but as the woman who had thrown herself into frozen water without hesitation to save his son. The realization pierced him, sharp and painful. He had insulted her hours earlier, dismissed her with words meant to keep her in her place, and yet she had done what no one else at that glitty ring party would have dared. The house staff had gathered at the garden's edge, wide-eyed and silent, their breaths puffing white in the cold as they watched the tableau. The billionaire on his knees, the boy trembling against the maid who had saved him, the shattered lake yawning black behind them. For once, no one whispered. No one smirked. Respect, long denied, hung heavy in the air. Alexander finally found his voice, hoarse and cracked. "Maya," he began, but the words caught in his throat. Gratitude, apology, guilt, they tangled together, refusing to come clean. He reached again for his son, but Ethan's small arms only tightened around Maya, his muffled voice trembling through tears. "Don't let her go, Dad, please. Don't let her leave." The plea struck Alexander harder than the cold wind. He had thought the models, the reputation, the image mattered most, but his son's broken voice revealed a truth he could not ignore. His son did not want wealth displayed in sequins or promises rehearsed under chandeliers. He wanted safety, he wanted love, he wanted Maya. Maya rocked Ethan gently, her own teeth chattering as the freezing water clung to her clothes. She glanced up at Alexander, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. "This boy doesn't need a picture-perfect mother paraded in front of cameras," she said quietly but firmly. "He needs someone who sees him, someone who will fight for him even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs something." Her gaze did not waver, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt stripped bare under someone's eyes. Not as a billionaire, but as a man who had failed to see what mattered. The snow fell heavier now, softening the scene, covering the broken ice with a white sheet, as though the night itself wished to bury the near tragedy beneath silence. Alexander finally gathered himself, his hands trembling as he touched Ethan's back. "Let's get him inside," he whispered, his voice no longer carrying the authority of command, but the rawness of a man shaken to his core. Together they carried Ethan into the house, Maya refusing to release him until warmth and blankets wrapped around his trembling frame. In the kitchen by the fire, staff rushed with towels and hot tea, and Alexander sat silent at the table, his head in his hands, his mind replaying the sound of ice shattering and the sight of Maya diving without hesitation. Guilt pressed down on him like a weight he could not lift. When Ethan finally drifted to sleep, clutching Maya's hand even in dreams, Alexander looked across the flickering firelight at the woman who had saved his son and realized his world had shifted. He was no longer the man who had thrown a party to display control. He was a man confronted by truth. And truth had a face, a name, and a quiet strength that humbled him. Yet pride dies slowly, and as the night stretched on, though gratitude swelled in his chest, Alexander wrestled with the shadow of his old self. Could he allow a maid, someone the world mocked and dismissed, to stand at the center of his family? Could he endure the whispers of investors, the smirks of society, the sharp words of the press? He did not know. But one thing was certain: without Maya, he would have lost his son tonight. And that thought alone carved a wound in his pride that would not heal easily. Upstairs, Ethan stirred in his sleep, whispering one word that made Alexander's throat tighten and his eyes burn despite himself. "Mom." And downstairs by the fire, Maya sat quietly, her uniform damp and her hair loose from its bun, unaware that she had already become something far greater than any title Alexander could ever bestow. She had become the heart his family had lost. A billionaire's reflection. The following morning arrived draped in a pale, reluctant light, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over a house that had nearly lost its heart the night before. Snow rimmed the state's long windows, muffling the city's pulse beyond the gates, and inside, silence stretched heavy across marble floors and gilded halls that seemed to echo with everything unsaid. For Alexander Pierce, the hours after the rescue had been sleepless, restless, and unrelenting. He had walked the length of his study 100 times, the fire dying to embers and flaring again as he fed it without thinking, his mind circling the same agonizing truths like a hawk tethered to a pole. Pride had built his empire, pride had shielded him through years of loss and loneliness, but pride had nearly cost him the only living thing that truly mattered, his son. And if not for Maya Johnson, a woman he had scorned only hours earlier, the house would have been filled not with silence, but with mourning. He sat at his desk, hands clasped, eyes staring at a family portrait framed in polished oak. The picture was old, Ethan barely 3, his late wife's arm curled tenderly around him, her smile radiant, her gaze warm enough to soften even Alexander's stiff posture. For years, Alexander had thought the only way to honor her memory was to keep her pedestal high, to allow no one unworthy to touch the space she had left behind. That was why he had kept women at a distance, choosing carefully who appeared beside him at galas, calculating who might one day be introduced to Ethan. He had believed he was preserving dignity, safeguarding reputation, but now the truth burned through that illusion. He had not been protecting his wife's memory or his son's well-being. He had been protecting his own pride, clinging to appearances while ignoring the needs of the child who had been silently calling out for something real. Upstairs, Ethan stirred beneath layers of blankets, his small body still exhausted from the shock of icy water, but his breathing steady and calm thanks to the warmth pressed against him during the night. Maya had refused to leave his side. Even when staff insisted she rest, she stayed in the armchair beside his bed, her posture firm despite her damp clothes and bruised skin. She had watched over him the way only someone who loved without conditions could watch, present, steady, and unyielding. And though Alexander had checked in several times during the night, hovering in the doorway, he had been too ashamed to step closer. Every time he saw Ethan's hand clasped around Maya's, he felt like a stranger in his own home, a man observing the family bond that had formed without him. By mid-morning, the household staff whispered of what had happened. The leaked footage from the garden security cameras had already escaped into the hands of the world. The internet had seized the image of Maya diving into the frozen water, her arms pulling Ethan to safety, the boy clinging to her like a lifeline. Clips spread like wildfire across news outlets, social media feeds, and glossy tabloids that had once obsessed only with Alexander's wealth. Headlines called Maya a hero, the maid who saved the billionaire's son. Strangers who had never set foot in the Pierce mansion debated her bravery, her humility, her role in Ethan's life. And while some celebrated her selflessness, others sneered at the notion that a maid might be woven into the story of one of the wealthiest families in the nation. Society had always been quick to praise heroes in private but criticize them in public, and Maya's life was about to be dissected under a merciless microscope. Harper Lynn, the ever-calm strategist, arrived at Alexander's study with a tablet full of updates, her voice sharp with urgency. "It's Eve." "Ryware," she said, sliding the footage toward him. "This isn't just gossip, it's global. You need to respond before the narrative spins out of control. You can praise her bravery without compromising the family's image." She hesitated on that last word because even she, who had made a career of protecting reputations, understood that the image Alexander had tried so hard to preserve had already cracked wide open. Alexander didn't reply immediately. He pressed his fingertips against his temple, watching the frozen frame of Maya holding Ethan in her arms, his son's small face buried against her shoulder. Something inside him shifted again, painful but undeniable. "Compromise," he repeated, his voice hoarse, "is what nearly killed my son." His words silenced Harper, who had never heard him speak with such rawness, and for the first time in years she wondered if her employer's ironclad walls were finally beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, Ethan had woken, his lashes heavy, his voice soft as he asked the first question that mattered to him. "Where's Maya?" She was still beside him, straightening the blanket with careful hands, her eyes tender and tired. "I'm right here," she whispered, and his small hand tightened around hers. When Alexander finally entered the room, hesitant, unsure, Ethan's gaze flicked toward him but did not linger. It was Maya he clung to, Maya whose presence calmed the tremors of memory still lodged in his bones. For a father who had spent years convincing himself he was providing everything, that small gesture was like a dagger twisted deep. "Maya," Alexander began, his voice cracking despite his effort to control it. But he faltered, because apologies were not currency he was used to spending. He had spent his life in boardrooms where power excused cruelty, where victories erased missteps, where money spoke louder than regret. Yet here, in front of a maid and his child, money had no weight, power had no shield. Only truth mattered, and truth was heavier than he had ever imagined. Maya spared him the struggle by lifting her gaze calm but firm. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her tone respectful but edged with resolve, "gratitude is not enough. If you truly mean to thank me, then respect Ethan's heart. Don't make him feel ashamed for loving someone who loves him back." The words struck harder than any public scandal. Ethan turned his small face toward his father then, his voice trembling but steady. "Dad, when I was sick, when I couldn't sleep, when you were too busy or too tired, Maya was there. She never made me feel small. I don't want models or cameras. I want her." His little voice filled the room like a verdict, one no court could overturn. Alexander's throat tightened. The empire he had built, the reputation he had guarded, the carefully drawn lines between staff and family, they all seemed absurdly fragile against the simple truth of his son's plea. He bowed his head, shame rising hot in his chest. For once he had no words, only the crushing realization that he had nearly lost everything because he could not see past his own pride. Downstairs, staff buzzed about the news, some giddy with admiration for Maya, others fearful of what this might mean for their own places in the household. Respect and resentment warred in whispered corners, and in the city beyond headlines churned, some praising the maid who had risked her life, others jeering at the idea of a billionaire's family entangled with a servant. The world was watching, waiting for Alexander Pierce to make his move. Would he defend Maya, honor his son's heart, or retreat behind the walls of reputation he had always chosen before? By the time night fell again, the house was no longer simply a mansion. It had become a battlefield of choices, between pride and humility, between image and love, between the life Alexander had built and the life his son longed for. Upstairs, Ethan slept peacefully, his hand still wrapped around Maya's, refusing to let go even in dreams. Downstairs, Alexander stood at his study window, staring at the reflection of his own face in the glass, seeing not the titan of industry the world admired, but a man stripped bare by truth. And in the silence of that reflection, he asked himself a question he had not dared before. Who am I, if not the man my son needs me to be? The answer did not come quickly, but it was there, waiting, like a dawn still hidden beneath the horizon. Love versus reputation. The storm of public attention arrived faster than anyone in the Pierce mansion could have prepared for. By the second morning after the incident at the lake, the long drive outside the estate gates was lined with vans from major news outlets, their cameras poised like weapons aimed at the grand facade. Reporters shouted questions through the cold air, their voices carried even beyond the high iron gates. "Mr. Pierce, will the maid remain in your employ? Is she now Ethan's legal guardian? Are you considering marriage, or is this just a publicity stunt?" The questions were sharp, intrusive, and relentless, and though the gates kept their bodies out, their words slipped through like cold drafts into every corner of the house. Inside, Alexander stood in the study before a half-circle of his closest advisors and board members, men and women who had invested in his empire and who now demanded assurances that their fortunes would not be endangered by his silence. They spoke with urgency, their words heavy with expectation. "You must control the story, Alexander. Distance the company from this scandal before it spirals. The public may romanticize this Maid today, but tomorrow they'll mock you for it, and mockery erodes respect." One advisor leaned forward, voice low but piercing. "It would be best to quietly dismiss her. Praise her heroism, of course, but move her out of the picture before this becomes a permanent stain." Every word pierced Alexander's ears like thorns, because only days ago he might have agreed. For years he had built his empire by bending to the harsh calculus of reputation. He had learned that perception was reality in boardrooms and headlines alike. But now, when he glanced at the still image frozen on his desk tablet, Maya's arms around his son, Ethan's small face pressed into her shoulder, something in him resisted their logic with a ferocity he had never felt before. That image was not a stain. It was salvation. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the heated room, quieter but stronger than any of theirs. "Dismiss her?" he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Dismiss the woman who saved my son's life? If you think I can spin gratitude into rejection and sleep at night, then you don't know me as well as you think you do." His words silenced them, but he knew silence did not mean agreement. He saw their pursed lips, their restless eyes, the way some shuffled papers as though distancing themselves from his choice. In their world, compassion was weakness, and weakness was a liability. But in another room upstairs, far from corporate debates, a boy and a woman were having their own conversation, one that cut deeper than any board member's warning. Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, crayons scattered across the blanket as he drew shapes of houses and stick figures. Maya sat beside him, folding laundry into neat stacks, her hands practiced and sure. "Do you think I made Dad angry?" Ethan asked suddenly, his little voice trembling with the weight of adult worries he shouldn't have carried. Maya paused, set down a folded shirt, and looked at him with steady eyes. "Why would you think that?" she asked softly. "Because I told everyone I want you to be my mom," Ethan murmured, his crayon pressing too hard, breaking the tip. He looked so mad. And now people outside are yelling. Maybe I made everything worse. His shoulders slumped under the burden of guilt. Maya reached out, taking his small hand in hers, firm but gentle. "Ethan, listen to me," she said, her voice low and resolute. "You didn't make anything worse. You told the truth of your heart. Sometimes adults forget how to listen, but that doesn't mean you were wrong. You don't ever have to be ashamed of wanting love. Love is never wrong." Her words sank into him like warmth into frozen ground. His small eyes welled with tears, but he nodded, clinging to her words the way he had clung to her arms in the icy water. Later that afternoon, Alexander entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe, watching the two of them. Ethan had drifted asleep, head resting on Maya's lap, his small chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of trust. Maya stroked his hair absently, lost in thought. Alexander's heart twisted at the sight, the simplicity of it, the completeness of it, the way his son looked at peace in her presence. He realized then that no amount of wealth, no number of gala photographs or polished models could ever manufacture this kind of bond. It was real, unplanned, undecided, and therefore priceless. When Maya noticed him, she did not flinch, but her eyes sharpened with the quiet strength that had carried her through countless indignities. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice calm but edged with resolve, "you need to decide what matters most to you. Not tomorrow, not after another meeting, now. Because Ethan is watching, and every moment you hesitate teaches him something about love and about respect." She shifted slightly, careful not to wake the boy. "If you choose appearances over his heart again, you may keep your empire, but you'll lose your son." The words hit like a hammer against glass, shattering the last illusions Alexander had clung to. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling with 1,000 responses that felt hollow. Finally, he admitted the truth he had been choking down. "You're right," he whispered, his gaze fixed on Ethan's sleeping form. "You're absolutely right. I've been blind." That evening, he called Harper back into his study. "Draft a statement," he said firmly, "and don't make it about reputation. Make it about truth. I will not hide what happened. The world needs to know she is not just a maid in my house. She is the woman who saved my son's life, and she deserves every ounce of respect I failed to give her." Harper blinked, startled, because Alexander Pierce was not a man known for humility. But she saw the steel in his eyes, and for once, she let her strategist's caution slip. "Very well," she said. "But you know this will cost you. The world loves a hero, but they will not love you for standing beside one they consider beneath you." Alexander's reply was quiet but unflinching. "If the cost of keeping my pride is losing my son's trust, then I would rather lose everything else." The next morning, the Pierce estate released an official statement praising Maya Johnson by name, acknowledging her as the woman who had saved Ethan and affirming that she would remain in the household, not as invisible staff, but as a valued member of the family's life. The statement was brief, but its honesty ignited firestorms. Supporters lauded Alexander for his humility, while critics sharpened their knives. Business journals speculated about boardroom unrest. Tabloids twisted the story into whispers of scandal and romance. Yet through the noise, one image remained constant: Maya's arms holding Ethan, a symbol of love stronger than pride. Inside the mansion, however, the storm outside mattered little compared to the quiet victories happening within. At breakfast, Ethan sat beside Maya rather than across from her. When a butler hesitated, unsure whether to pour her coffee, Alexander himself reached across, filling her cup with steady hands. It was a small gesture, but in that moment the house itself seemed to shift, warmed not by fireplaces but by respect newly born. Still, shadows lingered. Among Alexander's peers, envy and disdain stirred. Some whispered that he had lost his edge, that he was allowing sentiment to undo years of careful image. One rival in particular, a man named Richard Harrow, watched the unfolding story with cold calculation, plotting how he might turn public sympathy into ridicule, how he might crush Alexander by attacking the woman at the center of it all. In the glittering circles of high society, knives are often hidden behind smiles, and Alexander's choice to honor Maya had made her a target. But in the heart of the house, none of that mattered to Ethan, who laughed freely at breakfast for the first time in months, his hand clutching Maya's as though anchoring himself to safety. And Alexander, watching his son's joy, understood this was not weakness. This was strength. This was family. Breaking chains of pride. The storm that had begun with whispers in glittering ballrooms soon grew into a tempest Alexander could no longer ignore. Each newspaper that landed on mahogany tables in the Pierce mansion carried her face now, Maya Johnson's, captured mid-stride as she carried Ethan from the frozen lake, water dripping from her uniform, her expression fierce and unyielding. Some articles praised her as a heroine, a symbol of selfless courage, while others sharpened their headlines like knives, reducing her to the billionaire's maid, or twisting her act of bravery into fodder for mockery. Talk shows debated whether she belonged in the house at all, commentators dissected her background, and strangers rummaged through her past as though dignity was not hers to keep. Inside the mansion, however, the rhythm of life had shifted in ways that no headline could fully capture. Breakfast, once a sterile affair of silence and polished silverware, now carried the sound of Ethan's laughter. He insisted on sitting beside Maya at the long oak table, and when servants hesitated to serve her, Alexander himself took up the task, pouring her tea or setting bread upon her plate. The first time he did it, the staff froze in astonishment, but Alexander's expression brooked no argument. He was beginning, awkwardly but earnestly, to rebuild the respect he had once denied her. Maya, though cautious, accepted these gestures not for her own pride, but for Ethan's stability. She had never been one to seek privilege, yet she understood that in this house every small action was watched and weighed, and by allowing Alexander's visible change, she was letting Ethan see what humility looked like in practice. Ethan thrived in this new warmth. Where once he had walked the halls with downcast eyes, he now darted between rooms with boyish energy, dragging Maya into games of hide-and-seek, tugging her hand when he wished. He had to show her a drawing, calling her name with unfiltered joy. For Alexander, watching his son blossom was both a balm and a mirror. He saw with painful clarity the difference between duty and love. He had given Ethan the best tutors, the safest home, the finest clothes. But it had been Maya who had given him what money could never buy, belonging. And for the first time in his life, Alexander admitted to himself that wealth had become a cage, gilded and proud, and he had mistaken its bars for protection. Yet beyond the estate's gates, resistance grew. Richard Harrow, an old rival of Alexander's, saw opportunity in scandal. Harrow was a man who thrived on image, who had built his fortune on crushing others with whispers before battles even began. He gathered allies in private clubs and high-rise offices, murmuring that Alexander Pierce was losing his edge, that sentiment was softening him, that aligning himself with a maid was unbecoming of a man meant to command respect. Investors began to murmur as well, not yet pulling out of Alexander's ventures, but questioning, always questioning, if he was still the figure they could trust to lead without distraction. Maya, though unaware of the full scope of these machinations, felt the weight of disdain in subtler ways. At the market one morning, she heard the sneer in a stranger's voice. There goes the maid, who thinks she belongs in the billionaire's world. At the park where she accompanied Ethan, she caught the sidelong glances of mothers whispering behind manicured hands. Their judgment rolled off her like rain on stone, for she had lived through worse, but what struck her was the way Ethan looked up at her after each whisper, his eyes wide with fear that she might leave. She always knelt down, brushed his hair from his face, and said the same thing, "I'm not going anywhere as long as you want me here." And his small shoulders would relax again, reassured by the certainty in her voice. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep clutching his stuffed rabbit, Alexander and Maya found themselves alone in the quiet kitchen, the air thick with unspoken words. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the faint scar that still traced her temple from the night he had thrown a glass in anger. He stared at it, guilt gnawing at him, until finally he spoke. "I was cruel to you," he admitted, his voice raw. "I spoke words I can't take back. I threw glass as though pride mattered more than people. You had every right to walk away that night. And yet you stayed. You saved him. You saved me." His eyes dropped, uncharacteristically unsure. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to earn it, if you'll allow me." Maya listened in silence, her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not angry, not forgiving, but honest. "Forgiveness isn't a prize to win, Mr. Pierce. It's a path. If you mean to walk it, you'll need to prove it every day, not with words, but with choices, not just with me, but with Ethan. He needs to know his father is a man who keeps his promises, not just one who makes them." She rose then, smoothing her uniform, and added softly, "Respect must not be spoken only in the kitchen. It must live in every hall of this house." Her words lingered long after she left the room, and Alexander sat in the glow of the fire, realizing that humility was not something he could perform for cameras or declarations. It had to seep into the marrow of his daily life, and in that moment he resolved that he would no longer measure his strength by wealth or control, but by his willingness to change. The following week tested that resolve. The family was invited to a charity gala, an event Alexander could not decline without fueling speculation. The ballroom was ablaze with chandeliers and chatter, EVs. Airy guest polished to a sheen of superiority. Alexander arrived with Ethan and Maya at his side, and though he had warned them both of the stares they would receive, even he was not prepared for the cruelty hidden in polite smiles. Whispers rippled as they entered. "He's brought the maid? This is his new family? How unbecoming." Ethan shrank against Maya's hand, and she held him tighter, whispering calm encouragement. When a rival hostess, sharp-tongued and glittering in diamonds, approached with mock courtesy, her words dripped venom cloaked in silk. "Such bravery you showed at the lake, Ms. Johnson. I suppose even servants can stumble into heroism once in a while." Laughter rippled in her wake. Alexander's jaw clenched, his pride urging him to keep silent, to maintain composure. But then he caught Ethan's wide eyes, brimming with confusion and hurt, and he remembered Maya's words, "Respect must live in every hall, in every room." So Alexander did what no one expected. He stepped forward, his voice clear and commanding enough to silence the room. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Maya, "is not merely staff. She is the reason my son stands here alive today. She is not a stain on our family's image. She is the one who restored it. And if anyone in this room believes her worth is measured by the uniform she wears, then perhaps you should question your own." His declaration rippled through the ballroom like thunder, and the stunned silence that followed was broken only by Ethan's small, proud smile as he looked up at his father with newfound admiration. In that moment, Alexander severed another chain of pride, publicly choosing respect over reputation. But as the applause rose, some genuine, some reluctant, Richard Harrow's eyes narrowed from across the room. He had seen enough to know that destroying Alexander's empire would no longer be achieved through whispers alone. If he could not shame the billionaire into retreat, he would poison Maya's name until the world itself turned against her. And in the days ahead, his schemes would unfold with ruthless precision. For now, however, in that glittering ballroom, Alexander Pierce stood taller than he ever had before, not as a man defending an empire, but as a father and as a man who was learning, at last, what it meant to choose love over pride. The trial of the heart. The days that followed Alexander's public defense of Maya were filled with equal parts warmth and unease. Inside the mansion, Ethan's laughter rang brighter than it had in years, carrying through the halls like sunlight spilling into rooms long shut. The boy had begun to walk taller, less burdened by the weight of adult conflicts, more certain that the people he loved would not disappear. He clung to Maya with the unshakable trust of a child who had nearly lost everything but had been saved, and every moment in her presence deepened the bond that no outsider's words could undo. Yet beyond the estate gates, the world's gaze grew sharper, its whispers louder, and Alexander knew that the storm was not passing, but gathering strength. Richard Harrow, cunning and relentless, had watched the gala scene unfold with narrowed eyes and a mind already weaving threads of malice. He had once respected Alexander's cold brilliance, his ruthless ability to turn ridicule into power, but this new Alexander, humble, protective, softened by affection, seemed to him weak and ripe for destruction. Harrow understood society's cruel taunt. Well, the public adored heroes but devoured them faster, and Maya's humble beginnings made her the perfect target. With a network of gossip columnists, paid informants, and opportunists who thrived on scandal, Harrow set his plan in motion. His scheme was simple: twist Maya's heroism into suspicion, dig through her past until even her sacrifices were questioned, and use every headline to make Alexander's loyalty look like foolishness. The first blow came subtly. Anonymous rumors began to circulate online. Was the rescue staged? Did the maid know cameras were there? Is this part of a calculated bid for influence in the Pierce household? The headlines grew darker. From maid to mistress, insiders question Maya's role. Photographs of her leaving markets or holding Ethan's hand were printed with captions designed to humiliate, painting ordinary moments as evidence of ambition. What was once praise became poison. Maya found her face plastered on tabloids at checkout counters, her name debated by strangers on television panels. She had always lived quietly, invisibly, but now she was dragged into the brutal spotlight, her dignity dissected as if it were public property. Inside the mansion, Ethan sensed the shift. He noticed how Maya avoided the newspapers, how her smile faltered when she thought he wasn't looking, how she stood a little straighter in public as though bracing herself for blows. The boy asked questions his father struggled to answer. Why are they saying bad things about Maya? Why are they lying? Alexander had no easy reply. For years he had been the one weaponizing perception, bending narratives to his advantage, but now the machine he once controlled was turned against him, and he felt the helplessness Maya must have carried all her life. He realized with a pang of guilt that while he had been shielded by wealth, she had always fought baddie. Les like this alone. One evening, Alexander summoned the board to his private office. Harrow had not yet shown his hand openly, but Alexander could smell his influence in every false headline. The board was restless, muttering about reputational damage, stock fluctuations, and whether Alexander's personal entanglement was compromising their empire. For a moment, Alexander felt the old instinct rise, to sever ties, to sacrifice one for the many, to retreat into cold logic. But then he remembered Ethan's voice, trembling and determined. "Don't let her go, Dad. Please, don't let her leave." The memory steeled him. "Gentlemen," Alexander said, his tone sharp as glass, "if any of you believe this company's foundation is weaker because I stand by the woman who saved my son, then you are welcome to withdraw your investments. I built this empire once. I can build it again. But I will not rebuild my son if I let him believe love is expendable." The room fell silent. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked away, but none dared challenge him further. For the first time in years, Alexander felt power not as a weapon, but as a shield. For Ethan, for Maya, for the truth that mattered more than balance sheets. Meanwhile, Harrow's plots deepened. He paid a former acquaintance of Maya's from years past to invent lies about her, feeding journalists stories of supposed debts, of ambition disguised as humility, of improprieties that never happened. One evening, as Alexander prepared for a charity event where he intended to speak openly of Maya's role in their lives, a breaking headline struck like a dagger. "Hero Maid or Gold Digger? Source claims Maya sought out billionaire household for personal gain." The article spread like wildfire, echoing Harrow's venom, designed not to prove anything but to plant seeds of doubt. That night the event was packed with guests eager to see how Alexander would respond. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, but beneath the glitter lay sharpened curiosity. Maya stood at the edge of the crowd, her navy dress modest, her posture firm, but her heart heavy. She hated the stares, the whispers, the way strangers dissected her life with greedy fascination. She wanted to slip back into invisibility, to protect Ethan from this cruel spectacle. Yet when she saw him tugging at his father's sleeve, his wide eyes fixed on her as if asking whether she would still be there tomorrow, she knew she had no right to retreat. Love, once chosen, demanded courage. The speeches began with polite formality, donors and dignitaries parading their causes. Then came Alexander. He walked to the podium, his figure tall beneath the glittering lights, the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. For a heartbeat he hesitated, the old instinct to placate and protect his empire whispering in his ear. But then his gaze fell on Ethan, who sat proudly beside Maya, small hand wrapped around hers, and the hesitation shattered. "My friends," Alexander began, his voice carrying through the hall, "in recent days you have read much about me, my household, and most of all about the woman seated there, Maya Johnson. Some call her a maid. Some call her a scandal. I call her the reason my son is alive today. I call her the one who has shown me what strength truly looks like. You may measure worth in titles or wealth. I have made that mistake myself. But my son has taught me something greater, that worth is found in love, in courage, in sacrifice. And if defending that truth costs me reputation, then let me say here and now, it is a price I will gladly pay. The room fell into stunned silence. No polished speech, no calculated PR statement could have carried the same weight as the unvarnished truth he spoke. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, not because she needed his defense, but because she understood how much pride he had set aside to stand before the world in her name. Ethan's face glowed with joy, his small chest puffing with pride, whispering to Maya, "See? He gets it now." But in a shadowed corner of the hall, Richard Harrow smiled a thin, venomous smile. Alexander's declaration had moved the room, yes, but Harrow knew how fragile public adoration could be. He leaned toward a waiting journalist, whispering words designed to spark the next scandal. Before the night was over, photographs of Maya would be twisted into false narratives, rumors of impropriety spread, and the fragile peace inside the Pierce household would face its greatest test yet. Back in the mansion later that night, after Ethan was tucked into bed still chattering about how proud he was, Maya sat by the window in quiet thought. Alexander entered softly, his expression weary but resolute. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, the man who had once dismissed her, the woman who had once thought she was invisible. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice low but steady. "They'll keep coming after me, after us. I can bear it, but Ethan, he shouldn't have to." Alexander moved closer, his jaw tightening with determination. "Then we face it together. No more silence. No more dismissals. If they want to fight, they'll fight both of us. Because you are not leaving this house. You are not leaving him. Not while I still breathe." His words rang with the vow of a man who had finally chosen love over fear. Yet even as they stood together in the quiet of that room, the storm outside raged fiercer, and Harrow's schemes gathered like thunderclouds. The trial of their hearts was only beginning, and both Alexander and Maya knew the price of love was about to grow steeper than they had ever imagined, the family chosen by love. The mansion seemed quieter than usual in the days after Alexander's public declaration, yet it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that lingered before a storm broke. The halls, usually humming with the footsteps of staff and the laughter of Ethan, carried an edge of tension. Newspapers arrived every morning with Maya's name stretched across their headlines, some praising her selflessness, others twisting her into a figure of ridicule. For every article that celebrated her bravery, another suggested she had overstepped her place, that she was manipulating affection to secure her position in the Pierce household. She had never sought recognition, never wanted her name in lights, and now she found herself wishing desperately for invisibility again. But she could not withdraw, not with Ethan looking to her every day with eyes full of trust and love, not with Alexander finally standing by her side, determined but burdened by the weight of the world's scrutiny. The boy noticed the way Maya folded the newspapers quickly and tucked them out of sight. He noticed the way she smiled more carefully now, as though guarding her emotions, and how she paused before stepping outside, bracing herself for the stairs. "Don't listen to them, Maya," Ethan said one morning as he climbed onto her lap at breakfast, pressing his small hands against her cheeks. "They don't know you like I do. You're my family. That's what matters." His words, simple and unpolished, carried a truth that cut deeper than any headline. Maya kissed the crown of his head, whispering, "As long as you know that, I can bear anything." Yet in her heart, she wondered how much more strain this house could endure before something broke. Richard Harrow's campaign of malice escalated. He paid for stories to be published that painted Maya's background as shameful, exaggerating her struggles, twisting hardships into scandals. He leaked photographs taken without consent, Maya holding Ethan's hand at the park, Maya shopping at the market, as though ordinary acts of care were sinister strategies. He even circulated a rumor that she had plotted the incident at the frozen lake to appear as a savior, a claim so outrageous it might have been laughable if not for how hungrily some outlets devoured it. Harrow's cruelty was not aimed at truth. It was aimed at exhaustion, hoping to crush her spirit and drive a wedge between her and Alexander. But in the Pierce mansion, something else was happening, something Harrow could not control. Alexander, who once measured worth in contracts and prestige, began to shed his armor of pride in ways both small and profound. At dinners, he no longer sat at the head of the table but beside Ethan, beside Maya. He made a deliberate effort to be present, to listen when his son spoke, to show with action rather than words that love was no longer an afterthought. Staff who had once treated Maya with polite distance now followed his example. The respect he gave her became the respect they dared to show. What had been a house of cold marble began to warm, not with fire, but with belonging. Still, Harrow's venom threatened to undo it all. The breaking point came one evening when a fabricated story surfaced, claiming Maya had accepted bribes from rivals in exchange for secrets about Alexander's household. The lie spread like wildfire, feeding doubts among investors, shaking the company's stability. Board members whispered of betrayal, journalists demanded answers, and strangers jeered from beyond the gates. The weight of it pressed hard against Maya. She feared that even if Alexander believed her, Ethan might one day hear these lies repeated so often he would begin to doubt as well. The thought of him looking at her with suspicion instead of love pierced her heart deeper than any insult ever had. That night, she packed a small bag. She could not bear the idea of being the cause of Ethan's suffering, nor the ruin of Alexander's empire. She told herself leaving was an act of protection, a sacrifice made quietly. Yet when she stepped softly into Ethan's room to kiss him goodbye, she found him awake, clutching his stuffed rabbit tightly to his chest. His eyes brimmed with tears even before she spoke. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he whispered. Maya froze, her heart cracking. She sank to her knees beside his bed, smoothing his hair with trembling hands. "I only want to keep you safe," she said softly. "Safe from the words, from the cruelty. If I stay, they will keep hurting you." But Ethan shook his head fiercely, his little voice breaking with desperation. "No, Maya. You make me safe. Without you, I'll only have the words. Please don't go. Please stay. You're my mom. I don't care what they say." His words carried the raw certainty of a child who knew love when he felt it. Maya's tears spilled freely then, her resolve crumbling. She realized that leaving would not protect him. It would wound him. He needed her presence more than he needed the absence of whispers. Alexander entered at that moment, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness, his posture rigid with determination. He had heard enough to understand what was happening. Stepping forward, he placed his hands gently on Maya's shoulders, his voice steady. "If you leave, Harrow wins. If you leave, my son loses. If you leave, I lose. Maya, you are not alone in this fight anymore. I will not let you carry this burden by yourself." His gaze met hers with unflinching resolve. "You once told me respect must live inside every hall of this house. Tonight I tell you love must too, and I will fight for both, for you, for Ethan, for the family we are becoming." And in the quiet that followed, Alexander realized that his greatest fortune had not been built in boardrooms, but found in the arms of a woman who had once been invisible, and in the small boy who had pointed to her with unflinching love and said, "I choose her."